Did you steal our scholarship money?
Where did you hear that, Deja?
It's going around the whole school. They're saying there's a complaint that you took money from the Ainsley Fund and changed grades to cover it up.
Okay. Before anything else, what's the source?
The what?
You've heard me say it every day for 2 years. Somebody hands you a claim, what is the very first question you ask?
Where it came from.
A claim with no source is worth nothing, no matter how loud it's traveling. So say it back to me. What do we actually know at this exact minute?
That there's a rumor going around.
That's all we know. Where did this one come from?
Who said it first? I don't know. It's just everywhere all of a sudden.
Then right now we don't actually know anything. A claim with no source isn't evidence. It's a rumor in a good coat.
The door opened before he could finish. The principal was standing there with a woman from the district office and a single sheet of paper, and she said his name in the careful voice people use when a thing has already been decided somewhere above them. And behind them, moving through the doorway with his hand already reaching out, came Gerald Ainsley, 64 years old, silver-haired, beloved by 3 generations of that town, the man who had hired Elliot 12 years ago and had stood beside him at his wife's grave. Jerry put his hand on Elliot's shoulder the way he had 1,000 times, and he said the words that would keep Elliot awake for a month. "Don't say anything, son. Not one word, not to anybody. You let me stand up for you to the board myself. I will vouch for you. We will fix this." Elliot would learn, in less than a day, exactly what that promise was worth, because that night, alone at his kitchen table, he would read the complaint all the way to the end, and he would find one sentence buried in it that only a single living person on this earth could possibly have written. And that person had just put a hand on his shoulder and told him not to worry. Here is what you would need to know to understand why those words landed on Elliot Hayes like a warm blanket instead of a warning. For 12 years, Gerald Ainsley had been the closest thing to a father Elliot had. Ainsley had built the debate program at Calder High School in the small town of Merritt, Indiana, from nothing into the pride of the county, and when Elliot came in as a nervous 26-year-old, Ainsley had chosen him, mentored him, handed him the team one round at a time. 4 years ago, when Elliot's wife Joanna died over one long terrible winter, it was Ainsley who sat in the hospital hallway with him, Ainsley who spoke at the service, Ainsley who came to the house on the bad nights so a widowed man and a grieving 11-year-old would not eat dinner alone. Jonah called him Grandpa Jerry. There was no version of Elliot's life, in his own mind, in which Jerry was anything but the one man who would never let him fall. So when the district put Elliot on paid leave that afternoon and walked him out of his own building, past his own students, and Jerry squeezed his shoulder and promised to fix it, Elliot believed him. They walked him out through the main hall at the end of the day, when it was fullest, which could not have been an accident. Past the trophy case where half the plaques carried the debate team's name, past kids at their lockers who went quiet as he came by. He kept his chin up and his hands still and his face level, because his students were watching, and a man's bearing in a hallway is sometimes the only argument he is allowed to make that day. Jerry walked beside him the whole way with a hand on his back, murmuring comfort, and to everyone watching it, looked like loyalty. It was a man walking his victim to the door to be sure he actually left. He drove home and told his son it was a mistake and it would blow over. Jonah was 15, and he had already heard the whole thing at school by lunch, the way kids hear everything, and he did not cry and he did not rage. He just looked at his father across the kitchen and asked, quietly, "Did you?" Elliot said no. Jonah nodded once, said okay, and believed him completely, and that total, unearned faith was somehow harder to carry than the accusation itself. Elliot half believed his own promise that it would blow over. He was wrong about that too. He read the complaint that night at the kitchen table, alone, after Jonah went to bed. It was 3 pages, typed, filed anonymously with both the school board and the state educator licensing board, which was the part that could end him for good. Anonymous complaints were allowed. The district was required to investigate any of them. It accused Elliot Hayes of embezzling from the Ainsley Scholarship Fund, the booster account that sent kids like Deja to college, and of falsifying student grade records to hide the theft. The Ainsley Fund was not a rich thing. It had been built a car wash at a time, a bake sale at a time, out of the wallets of people who did not have much and gave anyway, because Gerald Ainsley had stood up at 100 booster meetings and promised that no Calder kid with a gift would ever miss college over money while he still drew breath. Parents who cleaned offices at night had put $20 into that fund. It was the most beloved thing in the county with his name on it. And it was, the complaint said, the thing Elliot Hayes had been quietly stealing. To be accused of taking from that fund in that town was not like being accused of a crime. It was like being accused of a sin. It was specific. It was well written. Whoever had written it knew the language of a school the way only someone inside one could. And then, on the second page, Elliot read a sentence that stopped his heart because it described a thing that only one other living person knew. 4 years ago, in the worst of Joanna's illness, Elliot had fallen behind on everything. He had entered a full set of quarter grades 11 days late and, panicking, had backdated the entry in the system so it would not flag as delinquent, so no one would look too hard at a drowning man. It was a small thing and a wrong thing, and it had eaten at him. And one night on his porch, he had confessed it to the only person he trusted with his failures. He had told Jerry. Jerry had put a hand on his neck and told him it was nothing, that grief makes men do small, clumsy things, that it would stay between them. Elliot had walked back into the house that night, lighter, the way you feel after a confession, grateful past words that there was one person on earth he could hand his worst self to. Joanna died 3 weeks later. The list of people who carried Elliot Hayes through that winter had exactly one name on it. And now, he had just read that name's handwriting in a document built to end him. The complaint described that exact incident. The late grades, the backdated entry, 4 years ago, offered as proof that Elliot Hayes has a documented history of falsifying official academic records. Elliot read it 4 times. He was a debate coach. He had spent his whole adult life teaching children a single discipline, which was that you do not accept a claim until you have traced it back to the mouth it came out of. Because every claim has a source, and the source is the whole truth of the thing. And he sat at his kitchen table at midnight and traced this one, the way he would have made a sophomore trace it, and there was only one place it could have come from. He had told exactly one person on this earth about the backdated grades. He had told him on a porch. In confidence? In grief. He did not sleep. He did not put his fist through the wall, though he wanted to. He sat with it, because a thing that big has to be carried carefully or it breaks the person carrying it, and because his son was asleep down the hall, and because some part of him was still begging the evidence to mean something else. Maybe Jerry had told someone. Maybe it had gotten out. He turned it over and over looking for another source. The way you check a citation you desperately want to be real. There wasn't one. The only door that fact could have come through was the man who had promised that same afternoon to vouch for him. The next morning, Jonah found his father at the table where he had left him. Jonah was 15, and he had his mother's stillness and his father's habit of watching before he spoke. He read Elliot's face, and he read the pages spread under the lamp, and he asked the only question that mattered. "Dad, who wrote it?" "I don't know yet," Elliot said, because he would not say the name out loud until he could prove it, because he had taught this boy that a name without proof is just a grudge. "But it's not anonymous, Jonah. Nothing is. Somebody sat down and typed this. Somebody knows things about me that almost nobody knows. That narrows it. So we find the source. That became the shape of the next 3 weeks, and it was the hardest kind of work because the town had already made up its mind, and the town was not cruel about it, which was worse. People he had known for years crossed the grocery store to avoid him, gently, sparing them both. The parents who had trusted him with their kids now looked at him and did the math the wrong way, because a man accused of taking scholarship money from children is guilty in the parking lot long before he is anything in a hearing room. It was hardest on Jonah, who had to keep walking into that building every day while it happened. Kids repeat what they hear at home. And one afternoon, Elliot came to pick his son up and found him sitting on the front steps of the school an hour after the buses had gone, not crying, just sitting. A boy had asked him at lunch how it felt to have a dad who stole college money from scholarship kids. Jonah had wanted to hit him and hadn't. "Was that right?" he asked his father. "That I didn't hit him?" Elliot sat down on the cold concrete next to his 15-year-old. He said yes, it was right, and that it was also the hardest kind of right there is, and that he was sorrier than he had words for that Jonah was paying for a thing he did not do. Then we find the source, Jonah said, and it was not a question. Yeah, Elliot said, we find the source. That night, they ate at the kitchen table. The two of them. The third chair where Joanna used to sit still pulled in, because Elliot had never been able to make himself push it out. He watched his son do homework with his jaw set, and he thought about how his wife would have handled Jerry. She had never quite trusted the size of the man's charm. She used to say that a person who needs a whole town to love him will, sooner or later, take whatever he has to take to keep it. Elliot had thought that was cynical of her. He had been wrong about a great many things, it turned out. He had just never been wrong about how much he had loved being wrong beside her. And through all of it, Gerald Ainsley was magnificent. He told everyone who would listen how much he loved Elliot, how he prayed this was all a misunderstanding, how a good man could still make a terrible mistake under the weight of grief. At a faculty meeting, unprompted, Jerry stood up and said he wanted to say something hard. He said he loved Elliot Hayes like a son. He said he would not believe the worst of him, and that he was asking everyone in the room to hold the boy in their hearts and reserve judgment. His voice broke on the word son, and half the staff reached over to squeeze his arm. Elliot, who was not there, heard about it within the hour from 3 different people, each of whom told him how moving it had been, how lucky he was to have a man like Jerry in his corner. Each time, Elliot said thank you. Each time, he understood a little better that he was being buried by a man holding a shovel in one hand and a bouquet in the other. He was, to every eye in Merritt, the heartbroken mentor standing loyally beside his fallen protege. Elliot understood, slowly, what he was watching. It was the most sophisticated thing a person could do. Jerry was not attacking him. Jerry was grieving him, publicly in advance. And every tear the old man shed nailed the coffin shut a little tighter, because you cannot argue with a man who keeps saying he hopes you're innocent. The vouching was not the opposite of the complaint. The vouching was the second half of the complaint. He had written the knife, and then arranged to be seen weeping over the wound. The district's own investigation, when it got to him, was polite and already finished. The investigator nodded at his answers and wrote very little, and leaned in with real attention only when Elliot said something that could be read as instability. And Elliot recognized the shape of the room because he had watched Jerry run one exactly like it for 12 years. Somebody had briefed this space before Elliot ever walked into it. He answered every question plainly, and he knew on the way out that plain answers were not going to be enough, that the calm truth of an accused man weighs nothing against a beloved man's tears. If he wanted to be believed, being innocent was not going to do it. He was going to have to find the source and set it on the table where no one in that town could look away from it. Elliot could not prove any of it yet. What he had was a fact with exactly one possible source and no way to show aboard that source without looking like a desperate man accusing a saint. So he did what he had spent his life teaching, and he went looking for a second thread. Because one source is a suspicion, and 2 sources is a case. The second thread came from his own kid, and it came because Jonah had actually listened to his father all those years. The complaint had been filed on paper and by email, but the paper copy in Elliot's hand had a small tell, a header and a footer in a specific format, and Jonah recognized it because every document that came off the school's own printing system carried it. Staff at Calder did not print to open trays. The district used secure release printing. You sent a job, you walked to any copier, you tapped your staff badge, or typed your PIN, and only then did it print, and the system logged all of it. Who sent what, from which account, at what minute, released at which machine. It was a small, unglamorous piece of school plumbing that existed to keep costs down, and nobody thought about it. And it had been quietly writing down the truth the whole time. Somebody printed that complaint on a school copier, Jonah said. That's a school header, and if they printed it here, the system knows whose badge released it. You can't get into that system, Jonah. No, but Mr. Nash can. Corey Nash was 26, and he was the district's one overworked IT technician. And he was the kind of person a school is built to walk past. He fixed the smart boards and reset the passwords and crawled under desks, chasing cables. And in 8 years, no teacher had ever once asked Corey Nash what he knew, because it did not occur to anyone that the guy under the desk knew anything. Corey Nash knew everything. He administered the print system. He kept its logs, all of them, going back years because keeping them was his job and he was quietly, invisibly, good at his job. Elliot went to him carefully, because he did not want to make it Corey's problem. But when he explained what he was accused of, Corey Nash went still in the way a decent person goes still, and then he said the thing that turned a suspicion into an investigation. The complaints got the school footer, then it went through release printing. I can pull the log. He was already typing. Every job's got an owner account and a timestamp. If it printed in this building, I can tell you whose badge let it out, down to the minute. He glanced up. I probably shouldn't do this without the district asking me to, but the district's the one investigating you, and nobody's asked me anything, and I've been doing this long enough to know that when nobody asks the guy who keeps the records, it's usually because the records say something somebody doesn't want said. Jonah was there, because Elliot had stopped leaving him out of it. Corey glanced at the boy, then back at Elliot. This your kid? Yeah? Corey nodded slowly, and something decided itself behind his eyes, the way it does in a man who has spent a whole career being invisible and has just been handed a reason to be seen. Once I pull this, there's going to be a name on it, he said. And once I've read the name, I can't unread it, and neither can either of you. You sure you want to know before you can prove it's fair to know? We teach that exact question in debate, Jonah said. Corey almost smiled. Then you already know the answer's yes. He pulled the log, and there it was. A print job whose document name matched, sent from a staff account and released 3 days before the complaint was filed at a copier in the faculty workroom outside the debate office. The account it was sent from belonged to Gerald Ainsley. For a moment, none of the three of them said anything. Corey looked at the screen and then carefully at Elliot. The way you look at a man, you have just handed something heavy. Jonah went still in the exact way his mother used to go still. And Elliot, who had braced for this for 3 weeks, found that bracing did not help at all. That there is no posture a person can hold that makes it stop hurting to see, in a district printer log, in plain gray type, the name of the man who had buried your wife alongside you. Elliot looked at the screen for a long time. 2 sources now. The fact only Jerry knew, and the printer log with Jerry's name on it. A suspicion had become a case. But he did not feel triumph. He felt something closer to grief, because part of him, right up to that screen, had still been hoping to be wrong. If a person ever stood beside you at the lowest moment of your life and let you believe they were the one thing you could lean on, and then used the very weight of your trust to knock you down, stay with this. Because what saved Elliot Hayes was not a lawyer and not luck. It was a lesson he had taught 100 teenagers and a son who had actually been listening. That there is no such thing as an anonymous accusation. That every word came out of a mouth, and the whole job is refusing to stop asking whose. Now Elliot needed to understand why. Because a board would want a why. And because he could not make himself believe that a man would burn down his own protege over nothing. He started where the complaint had started, with the Ainsley Fund. He had, in the last year, begun helping keep the fund's books, which was part of why he was being handed the department. And 6 months ago, he had noticed something and set it aside. The way you set aside a small wrong number when you trust the person whose number it is. Scholarship disbursements that did not quite match the students who had received them. A vendor for team travel that he could not place. He had assumed he was reading it wrong. He had trusted the name on the account. He went back to it now, with Jonah beside him at the kitchen table. Because 2 people who both refuse to look away are harder to fool than one. And because he had decided to stop shielding his son from the truth and start teaching him how to survive it. They did it the slow way, the debate way, 1 line at a time, tracing each odd number back to whatever it claimed to be. A reimbursement to a vendor. Jonah looked the vendor up, and it did not exist. No address, no filing, nothing. A payment for a tournament trip. Jonah checked it against the team calendar his father had kept for years, and there had been no trip that week. Every thread they pulled came loose in their hands, and every loose thread pointed the same way. Jonah looked up from the vendor that did not exist. Elliot looked back at him, and the 2 of them understood the same thing in the same second, without either of them having to say it, which was that every loose thread pointed the same direction, and the direction was not Elliot. The money had been walking quietly out of the students' fund for years, and it had all walked the same way, toward the man who had built the fund and then lived off it while the town handed him awards for his generosity. Elliot did not tally the total that night. He did not need a number. The direction was the whole answer. The complaint had accused him of taking the students' money. Every dollar of it had gone the other way. And Elliot finally understood the whole grammar of it. He had not been chosen at random. He had been chosen because he had gotten close to the books, because he was about to be handed the department and would have been handed the fund with it, and because a man cannot skim a fund whose new keeper reads a citation for a living. Jerry had not attacked Elliot out of jealousy alone, though the jealousy was real. The old lion watching the young one, the students loved. He had attacked to survive. He had accused Elliot of Jerry's own crime, precisely down to the falsified records, because the safest place to hide your sin is stapled to someone else's name, and because if it ever came out that money was missing, the paperwork would already point at the man he had spent 3 weeks tearfully mourning. He was not even, it turned out, the first. That was the thread that opened the whole thing wider than one fund and one man. A retired teacher named Paula Hendricks lived 2 towns over now, out of the profession entirely. And when Elliot's story started moving quietly through the small world of Indiana educators, she reached out to him because she had been waiting 11 years for someone to believe a thing she had stopped being able to say out loud. Paula Hendricks had been a young star at Calder once, a teacher the kids adored, and she had been on track to take over a program Gerald Ainsley did not intend to give up. And one spring, an anonymous complaint had appeared accusing her of misconduct, specific and well-written and impossible to fully disprove. And Gerald Ainsley had stood loyally beside her and told everyone how much he loved her and how he prayed it was a misunderstanding. And by summer, she was gone. Her name quietly ended, and Jerry had kept his program and his fund and his throne for another decade. They met at a diner off the highway, halfway between her town and his. Paula Hendricks was 52 now and taught nothing. She managed a paint store. She had a folder of her own, 11 years old, gone soft at the corners from being carried. "I used to be able to say it," she told him, turning a coffee cup she never drank from. "For about a year after, I told anyone who'd listen. It was Jerry. He wrote it. I know he wrote it. And every single one of them looked at me the way you look at a bitter woman who can't accept she got caught. So I stopped. You stop saying a true thing long enough, you start to wonder if you made it up." She looked at him. "What have you got that I didn't?" he told her. The detail only Jerry knew. The printer log, the fund running the wrong way, toward the accuser. Paula Hendricks listened, and something in her face that had been folded shut for 11 years began, very carefully, to open. "I'll come," she said before he could ask, "whatever room you need me in. I have been waiting 11 years to finish one sentence. If you are hearing this, and you have ever been undone by a whisper you could not trace, understand that the whisper had a mouth, and the mouth had a reason. And the only thing that ever protects the next person is somebody finally refusing to let the word stay anonymous." Elliot had his case now, 3 threads braided into one rope. The fact only Jerry knew. The print log with Jerry's name and the minute. The fund that ran the wrong way toward the accuser. And Paula Hendricks, who was willing after 11 years to come and say out loud what had been done to her. A financial crimes investigator from the state, once Elliot brought her the fund records, opened a file with the tired relief of someone who has suspected a thing for years and finally been handed the proof. His union representative laid it out for him straight the week before the hearing. "These cases almost never go the teacher's way," the man said, "because the standard is not proof. It is the board's comfort, and a board is most comfortable believing the quiet story that lets it go home early." "Being innocent," he told Elliot, "is not a plan." "I know," Elliot said. "I don't have a plan built on being innocent. I have one built on a source. 3 of them, braided together." He thought about the man who had taught him. Jerry spent 30 years training this whole town to respect exactly one thing above everything else, a claim you can trace back to where it came from. I'm just going to give them one and let them do what he taught them. But Gerald Ainsley was not a man who lost, and he had not survived 30 years of running a school by being careless. He felt Elliot moving, and he moved first, because that was his whole method, to get to the room before you did. He went to the board privately and reported sorrowfully that he was concerned Mr. Hayes was now harassing witnesses and interfering with an active investigation, and that in his grief and guilt, The poor man had begun spinning wild conspiracy theories even, he was heartbroken to say, accusing his own mentor. He got Elliot's building access revoked entirely. He had a letter placed in Elliot's file, noting the new concerns about the subject's stability. By the time the board hearing arrived, Jerry had already told them the story of the desperate, guilty man who would say anything, and had told it so gently, with so much love, that the board walked into the room already knowing how the sad thing ended. Jerry came to see him once, before the hearing, alone. He found Elliot in the grocery store parking lot of all places, and he walked up, wearing the same warm, sad face he wore everywhere now. And for a moment, it was so exactly the face of the man who had sat with Elliot in a hospital hallway that Elliot's chest ached. Jerry said he was worried about him. He said the things Elliot was saying, against him, of all people, were the talk of a man coming apart, and that it grieved him to hear them. He said that even now, even after all of it, he would help Elliot find a soft landing, a quiet resignation, if Elliot would only stop and spare his son a public hearing that could end just one way. "Walk away, son," Jerry said, gentle as ever. "Some fights you lose worse by winning them. Think about the boy." And Elliot looked at the man who had taught him everything, and understood that this was the tell. The same move every time. Get to the person before the room does, and make their love for their own child the lever. "You sent my name to a printer 3 days before you filed," Elliot said quietly. He watched it land. For half of 1 second the warmth went out of Gerald Ainsley's eyes, and something older and colder looked back. And then the sad kind mask slid down over it again, smooth as glass. "I don't know what you think you found," Jerry said. But he had heard the word printer, and they both knew it. And he walked back to his car, a little faster than a man with nothing to fear walks. "I'll see you at the hearing," Elliot said to his back. The hearing was held in the district boardroom on a Tuesday evening, and it was full, because in a town like Merritt, a scandal about a beloved teacher and a scholarship fund fills a room. The board sat at the long table. Elliot sat with a plain folder and a union representative who had told him honestly that these things almost never go the accused's way. Jonah sat in the second row because he had refused to stay home. Paula Hendricks sat near the back in a coat she had bought for the occasion, next to a man from a district IT department who was holding a laptop, and next to a woman from the state nobody there recognized. And Gerald Ainsley sat up front, close to the board, where a legend sits, ready to be asked for his wisdom. The board read the complaint. They presented the fund discrepancies, and they presented them as Elliot's, because the complaint had framed them that way, and the framing had had 3 weeks to set like concrete. They noted the old backdated grades, the documented history. It was, laid out by people who already believed it, a clean and damning story. And then, because it was the decent thing to do, the board chair invited Gerald Ainsley to speak as the person who knew the accused best. And Jerry rose, and the room softened toward him the way a room softens toward someone it has loved for a long time. He was extraordinary. He did not accuse Elliot of anything. He talked about a bright young man he had taken under his wing, about the tragedy of losing a wife so young, about how grief can hollow out even a good person, about how it broke his own heart to be sitting here. He said he still hoped, he truly hoped, that there was some explanation. He said that he would give anything for this not to be true, and every soft, sorrowful, loving word drove another nail, because he was not there to convict Elliot. He was there to make Elliot's conviction feel like a kindness. When he sat down, there were people in that room wiping their eyes, and the board chair looked at Elliot the way you look at a man whose own beloved mentor can only bring himself to hope, and reached for the gavel to move toward a vote. "I'd like my 3 minutes," Elliot said. "The complaint is anonymous. I'd like to talk about that word." He did not raise his voice. He was a debate coach, and he had stood in 100 rooms that had already decided against his kids. And he knew the only thing that survives a room like that is not passion. It is a source. "I teach these students one thing above everything else," he said. "When someone hands you a claim, you do not argue with it, and you do not cry about it. You trace it. You find out where it came from. Because a claim is only ever as good as the mouth it came out of. So I'm going to do to this complaint exactly what I'd make a 15-year-old do. I'm going to find its source." He held up the second page. He read the sentence about the backdated grades 4 years ago, during his wife's illness. And then he told the room the truth, Plainly, that it had happened, that he had done it, a drowning man entering late grades and backdating them, and that he was not proud of it. "It's real," he said, "which is what makes it useful, because I told exactly one person on this earth about it. Not my union, not my family. One person on my porch the year my wife was dying, because he was the one man I trusted with the worst things about myself." He let that sit. So whoever wrote this anonymous complaint didn't find that in a file. There is no file. They heard it from me, or they heard it from the one man I told. That sentence has exactly two possible sources in the entire world, and I'm one of them, and I didn't write a complaint against myself. The room had gone very still, and Gerald Ainsley, who had spent 30 years being the smartest man in every room, made the first mistake of a cornered animal because he could not stand to let an argument go unanswered. He said gently, reasonably, that things get around to school, that Elliot might have mentioned it to others over the years and forgotten, that a single detail proved nothing, and that he hated to see the boy reaching like this. "Maybe," Elliot said. "A single source is a suspicion. You taught me that." He looked at his mentor for the first time. "So let's get a second one." He nodded to the back of the room, and Corey Nash stood up with his laptop and did the least dramatic and most devastating thing that happened that night. He explained, in the flat voice of a man describing plumbing, what secure release printing was, and that every document printed in the district carried a log entry, and that the complaint on the table bore the district's own print footer, which meant it had been printed on a district machine. And then he read the log entry for that document, sent from a staff account, released 3 days before the complaint was filed, at 4:12 in the afternoon, at the copier in the faculty workroom outside the debate office. And he read the name on the account that had sent it, and the name was Gerald Ainsley. There is nowhere in a room to put your own name on the printer log of the anonymous letter you filed. Jerry's face did the thing Elliot had been dreading and needing to see, the smooth surface finally cracking, and he said too fast that his account was probably left logged in, that students had access to the workroom, that anyone could have used his badge. It was a good answer. It was the answer of a man who had always been able to talk his way back to solid ground. And for a moment, it worked. Heads nodded. Of course a badge could be borrowed. Of course a workroom was a public place. Of course a beloved man would never print his own crime under his own name. The board chair's hand drifted back toward the gavel, and Elliot felt the whole room begin to slide back toward the story it had walked in, believing. The sad, guilty young man and the grieving old saint and Jonah, in the second row, had gone white. Elliot did not let the slide finish. "One source is a suspicion," he said again, louder now, level. "So here is a second and then a third. And then you can stop being kind to me and start doing arithmetic." He laid the fund records on the table, 9 years of them, and he did not accuse anyone. He traced the way he traced everything: a vendor that did not exist, a tournament trip that never happened, a reimbursement to a company that turned out to be a rented mailbox, every dollar walking away from the students and toward one name. He did not have to say the name aloud. It was printed on every line. And that was when the woman from the state stood up, and beside her, Paula Hendricks stood up, and the ground stopped being solid. The investigator introduced herself and the case number and said that a review of the Ainsley Scholarship Fund, conducted with the district's own records, showed that over 9 years, roughly $180,000 had been diverted from the fund through false vendor payments and reimbursements, and that the money had not gone to Elliot Hayes, whom the complaint accused, but to Gerald Ainsley, whose name was on every transfer. And then Paula Hendricks, who had been silent for 11 years, told the room in a shaking voice that had gotten steadier by the end that the same thing had been done to her. An anonymous complaint, a loving public defense, a career quietly ended the year she had come too close to a program and a fund that a man was not willing to give up. The room that had been weeping for Gerald Ainsley 10 minutes earlier turned, all at once, the way a room turns when it realizes it has been the instrument of the thing it thought it was mourning. The board chair set the gavel down. Nobody was voting on Elliot Hayes that night. Elliot looked back once at the second row. Jonah was crying, openly, the way a 15-year-old cries when a weight he has carried for a month finally lifts. And he was not looking at his father. He was looking at Grandpa Jerry at the wreckage of a man he had loved his whole life, learning in one night the most expensive lesson his father had ever taught, that the people who perform the most love are not always the ones who are carrying it. And Elliot Hayes, who had every right to stand up and destroy the man in front of the whole town, looked at his mentor across the room and did not raise his voice, because his son was in the second row, and because some part of him was still, impossibly, grieving. "You taught me to find the source," he said. "Every claim, every time, no matter who it hurts. You gave me the exact tool I used tonight." He closed his folder. "I keep waiting to feel like I won something. I don't. You were the best teacher I ever had, and you were a thief the whole time, and both of those are true, and I have to go home and explain that to a 15-year-old who called you Grandpa." The reckoning came in the weeks after, because a thing pulled into the light does not go quietly. The state charged Gerald Ainsley, and not with one thing, but with a pattern of them. The fund and the false complaints both, and the print logs and the fund records, and Paula Hendricks were the spine of it. He fought the way men like that fight, with his reputation and his tears and 30 years of goodwill. And for a while, it almost worked, because a town does not want to believe it was fooled for a generation. What finished him was the same thing that had built him. He had needed, always, to be the cleverest voice in the room. He had made the complaint too good. He had included the one perfect, private, devastating detail, because a lesser lie would not have satisfied his craft, and that detail had exactly two sources, and one of them was sitting at his own printer with his own name in the log. The town took it hard, harder in some ways than the theft, because these were not bad people. They were people who had loved a man for 30 years and had wept for him at a hearing while he steered them like a jury. Some of them could not look at Elliot afterward, out of shame. Some looked at him too much, trying to apologize with their faces for a thing too big for faces. He took it the way he took most things now, quietly, because he had not cleared his name for their eyes. Gerald Ainsley never stood in a classroom again. At his own hearing, months later, the tears that had moved 1,000 rooms did not work anymore, because the town had finally learned to ask where a thing came from, and it had turned that question, at last, on him. He took a plea rather than let Paula Hendricks and Elliot Hayes and a district printer log all speak in the same room on the same day. Before it was done, he asked to say one thing, and what he said was that he had built something real once. The program, the kids, all of it, and that somewhere along the way he had come to believe the thing he built could not survive without him, and that a man who believes that will burn down anyone who proves him wrong. It was not an apology. It was the truest thing he ever taught. Elliot was reinstated. The state licensing complaint was dismissed as fraudulent, and the district, in the awkward way institutions apologize, gave him the department chair after all. He almost turned it down. The chair had been Jerry's. The office still had Jerry's diplomas on the wall and Jerry's mug in the drawer. But Deja and a dozen kids like her needed the program to survive its own scandal. And a program does not survive on a vacancy, so he took it. The first thing he did was move the fund's books out into the open where any parent could read them, and he posted them every month, every line with a source next to each one. The fund was made whole out of what the state recovered and what the community, ashamed, raised in a single furious month, and Deja and the kids like her kept their scholarships. Deja gave the graduation speech that spring, and she spent 30 seconds of it on the one thing her coach had drilled into her, that a claim is only ever as good as the mouth it came out of. And she looked straight at Elliot in the third row when she said it. It was the closest he came all year to breaking down in public. Paula Hendricks got a letter 11 years too late, and she framed it, she told Elliot, not because it gave her back the years, but because it finally gave her back the sentence she had never been allowed to finish. But the part that mattered did not happen in the boardroom. It happened at the kitchen table, a few nights after, when Jonah asked the question he had been carrying since the printer log. "Did you know it was him before, when he put his hand on your shoulder in the practice room?" "No," Elliot said. "I believed him completely. That's the part I have to live with. He was the last person on earth I would have traced, which is exactly why he could do it. So how do you ever know who to trust?" Elliot thought about that for a while, because his son deserved a true answer, and not a comforting one. You don't, all the way. You trust people, because a life without trust isn't worth the safety. But you keep the habit anyway. You keep asking where things come from, even the things you don't want to check, especially those. Not because everyone's lying, because the one who finally isn't who you think, that's the one who counts on you never asking. A week later, Elliot was back in the practice room with the stopwatch and the same 4 kids. And Deja stood up to give a rebuttal, and she quoted a statistic hard and fast, the way they do when they think they've won, and Elliot held up one hand and stopped the clock. Good. Now, where did that number come from? It's from the brief. And where did the brief get it? Deja opened her mouth and closed it and grinned because she had walked into it on purpose, because she had learned to love the trap. I don't know yet, she said. Then you don't have it yet. He clicked the watch. Go find out who said it first. Somebody always did. Jonah was in the doorway, waiting to walk home with his dad, and he was smiling a little, because he had heard that lesson his whole life and had watched it save them, and he knew now that it was the most valuable thing his father had ever been given, and that the man who gave it to them had not been able to take it back on his way down. A good lesson outlives the mouth that taught it. That is the one thing an accusation can never do. On the walk home that afternoon, Jonah repeated something he had heard, that a teacher 2 towns over was saying Calder had only ever won because Ainsley cheated the judges. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Where'd you hear that? Some kid at practice. And where did the kid hear it? Jonah started to answer, stopped and grinned. I'll find out, he said. Somebody said it first. Elliot put an arm around his son's shoulders, and they walked the rest of the way home, not saying anything, and it was enough. There is no such thing as an anonymous accusation. Every word came out of a mouth, and every mouth belongs to someone, and the powerful count on you being too frightened, or too grateful, or too loyal to ask whose. If a thing is ever whispered against you, and you cannot find where it started, do not stop looking. Somebody wrote it. Somebody printed it. Somebody knew a detail only one person could have known. Send this to the one who taught you to ask better questions, and go find the source, because it is always there, and it is never no one.